Everyone, welcome. Ooh, yes, it is. Welcome to our Harvard Undocumented Staff panel and discussion. I am so excited for you all to be here. Folks are going to keep coming in and coming into the meeting, but we do want to get started since we have amazing panelists that I'm sure all of you would enjoy. So to begin, my name is Diana Ortiz Giron, and I am the Assistant Director for the Office of Diversity, Education, and Support at Harvard College. And I am joined by my co-host, Ariana Aparicio Aguilar, who is the Research Assistant at the Immigration Initiative at Harvard. We are both coming to you as me as a formerly undocumented staff member and Ariana as a currently documented staff member. And so we hope that you would enjoy this panel with us. We want to thank our sponsors, the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinic for always helping us with these conversations, the Immigration Initiative at Harvard for helping to sponsor and publicize and advertise this event, and my office, the Office of Diversity, Education, and Support. And of course, we want to thank our student organizations, the Act on a Dream at Harvard College and the Undocu Allies Initiative at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So we know that this is a Harvard event, but even if you're not from Harvard, we welcome you into the space and all of your expertise. And we hope that this will be a conversation that goes beyond our campus community, especially during this remote time that we are in. We had originally scheduled this panel for last week, and we actually postponed it to commemorate Juneteenth. While the US has still not declared this a national holiday, Juneteenth marks the official end of slavery in Texas on June 19 of 1865. This was actually 89 years after the Independence Day on July 4th of 1776, and 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation executive order on January 1 of 1863. It's important for us to know this history and to know this knowledge, especially as we celebrated Juneteenth last week and as we think about Independence Day coming up next week. As someone who is formerly undocumented, Independence Day brings up reminders that for most of my life, my community and I have been considered unwanted foreigners who have not been accepted by the country that we call home. I know that this sense of being considered second-class citizens or not citizens at all is felt by many people of color in this country. And Juneteenth is a reminder to us all that nobody is free until everybody's free, as said by Fannie Lou Hamer, and that the call for us to support Black Lives Matter movement is ongoing. And let's remember that our fight for the dignity and respect of all immigrants also includes that of Black immigrants. So thank you for being here, and I hope that we will all continue to celebrate, liberate, and educate ourselves on how to make sure that we're not treating this moment as just a firework that goes off, but rather as a burning bush and a flame and a passion that is ongoing beyond this moment. Like other Undocu support professionals all over the country, we intended this panel to be a post-DACA event, and we're actually very pleasantly surprised when we received a favorable decision from the Supreme Court decision last week. We know that there are many folks in this call who have a lot of DACA-specific questions, and that some of those answers may vary by case-to-case basis. Even immigration lawyers are still trying to get more information and advise folks on an individual basis. At the end of our panel, we will provide some preliminary post-DACA decision resources. And as more information becomes available, we encourage all of us to share those resources at the end in the Facebook event page for this event. And even though the decision was a positive decision, there's still a lot of questions about whether the administration will make another attempt to dismantle DACA, which reminds us all that the fight is not over. And if you're able, we encourage you to connect with local nonprofit immigrant organizations and local legal services, and even your educational institutions for financial aid support. We know that not all of these resources may be available, but we do hope that you would connect with those local entities. And for allies, we hope that you would consider donating to the DACA Renewal Fund hosted by the United We Dream Network. As folks are considering and anticipating to renew their DACA or even apply to DACA for the first time, that fund will be amazing for you all to consider donating to. I'm gonna take a second to just rearrange my PowerPoint as I am having some technical difficulties on my end. I apologize for the inconvenience. There we go. All right. So for a couple of logistics for this event, our panel will be recorded and the question and answer will not be recorded. So we'll stop the recording when we get there. Participants, you are muted right now. But when you are engaging in the question and answer portion, and if you wanna ask your question verbally, we can unmute you by just raising your hand. And Ariana will be managing that aspect of the panel when we get there. And our structure will be that each panelist will be introduced. All of them will be introduced all at once. And then I will engage in a conversation with each of them for around 10 to 12 minutes where they will be answering 3 customized questions that they've approved of as well. And we hope that throughout this event that we will all uphold the values of respect, understanding that undocumented folks are the experts in their own experience, and that even though they are the experts in their own experience, they don't speak for the entire community. As you can see, today our panelists are 3 voices within the hundreds and thousands of voices within the undocumented immigrant community. And while all of our panelists are Latinx working professionals at Harvard, there is so much more diversity within our community, including the unique nuances and perspectives offered by Black and Asian undocumented folks who are not represented in this panel. So I will now introduce our panelists one by one and then engage in an individual conversation with each of them. And give you an opportunity to ask preliminary questions at the beginning of this. So as you hear their introduction and their bios, we hope that you will start thinking about some potential questions that you might be wanting to ask each of them. All right. I will begin with Pierre. So let me just, again. So Pierre Berastian is director of the Office of Sexual Assault and Prevention and Response at Harvard University. He has a bachelor's in social anthropology from Harvard College and a master's of divinity from Harvard Divinity School. Prior to working at Harvard, Pierre worked in a variety of organizations, such as the Innovation and Engagement at the National Latino Network for Healthy Families and Communities, Renewal House, a domestic violence shelter, and the Hispanic Black Gay Coalition. He was also the co-founder of the Massachusetts Restorative Justice Collaborative and served as co-chair of the Massachusetts GLBT Domestic Violence Coalition. Among being a fellow for the Gay Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation's National People of Color Media Institute in 2019, he was also named top 25 most influential LGBTQ people of color in Boston. Pierre is originally from Peru and undocumented from 14 years until he received DACA in 2012, which he currently still has. So thank you, Pierre, for being here.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Pamela Portocarrero is currently the executive coordinator at the Government Performance Lab at Harvard Kennedy School and previously worked to develop fundraising strategies for the Harvard Kennedy School Alumni Relationship and Resource Development Office. She earned a master's in public administration from Old Dominion University and a bachelor's degree in political science and international studies from the University of Utah. Bringing a decade of experience working in the intersections of education, policy, social justice, and activism, including increasing college access and education in the states of Utah and Nevada, and connecting grassroots organizations with the state and local government agencies around issues of immigration, school-to-prison pipeline, and community engagement. She is currently a DACA recipient and recently became a mom to a baby who is now 5 months old. So welcome, Pamela. We're so excited for you to be here.
Thank you.
Matias Ramos, our third panelist, is the director of programs at Phillips Brooks House Association, where he continues to work in the areas of public service and community engagement. Prior to working at Harvard, he worked at Tufts University and was a fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, National Immigration Law Center, and the UCLA Labor Center. Originally from Argentina and formerly undocumented for 13 years, Matias holds a bachelor's in political science from UCLA, where he was a beneficiary of California's AB 540, a state policy that granted undocumented students in-state tuition. A longtime immigrant rights activist and one of the co-founders of the United We Dream Network. In 2009, Matias moved to DC to support the fight for the Federal Dream Act, leading to his detention that put him on deportation proceedings in 2010. but winning a stay of deportation under the Obama administration. Matias is here to stay and now lives in Malden with his wife and son. So thank you, Matias, for being here. Wonderful. So I will now take off the screen and I will now engage in a conversation with our panelists one by one. So let me get that. Stop sharing. All right. So I'm now gonna invite Pierre to the Zoom floor and I will now be asking the first question. As a reminder, at this time, I want to invite you to ask any preliminary questions, and Ariana will keep them for consideration at the end of the panel. So we do invite you to stay engaged. And throughout the panel, if one of the panelists says something that you resonate with, that you appreciate it, we hope that you would also use the chat box as ongoing engagement. All right. So Pierre, welcome. I'm so excited to talk to you. My first question to you is, you have studied at Harvard and worked at Harvard for a total of 10 years, if not more, as both the Harvard College and Divinity School alum. Can you tell us a little bit about your time navigating Harvard as an undocumented student and observations you've made about where Harvard was then and where Harvard is now? Perhaps some narratives have shifted on campus. You've witnessed moments of cultural change. But what structural changes do we still need to make as an institution in regards to supporting undocumented students?
Right. So there are about 3 questions in there. So let me see how I can answer them. So let me start with, I think when I first came, there were some undocumented students at Harvard who didn't know each other. It was kind of this underground, unspoken network, and almost, I don't want to say shame, but fear around being undocumented, right? And it came, you know, we live in a Harvard bubble, and many institutions, many schools are their own bubbles and their own ecosystems. But what I remember clearly was the national dialogue that impacted my own ability, and I think my peers' abilities who were undocumented, to integrate and to relate to the larger university, right? At the time, we had a lot of anti-immigrant dialogue, a lot of anti-immigrant sentiments. And I think that's where that feeling of isolation and sometimes fear came from. And so as a result, you ended navigating the university and your life in a very isolated manner, in a way that you didn't have a network of support. And so when things happen, as they do in life, whether they are some act of violence that happens towards you, or your mental health declines, you're in the middle of a depression because you haven't seen your family in years, or you haven't seen your grandparents in a decade, or you know, just when life happens to an undocumented person, it already is difficult. But what made it more difficult was going through it alone and not having someone or people, a community that you could rely on, and in a way dissipate those feelings through the power, that healing power of community. That's something that I have seen shift drastically at Harvard, and I think across the country, that more campuses are creating communities around the experiences of undocumented people. And that's important for a number of reasons, right? You do have that institutional support. You do have that community that you can backfall on. You do have that shared experience that, in a way, as I mentioned, dissipates the struggle and makes you stronger. So that's something that I have seen shifted. I like you know, how you ended that question of what else do we need to do as a campus, but I don't want to think just about Harvard, but you know, in the field as a whole, there is a lot that we still need to do. So when I think about the structures that universities have and the lack of comprehensive supports for undocumented students, right? Typically there is, if we're lucky, one coordinator for undocumented folks, or one go-to person who becomes the minister, the pastor, the mental health clinician, the social worker, la tia, the aunt that you go to, becomes your family, becomes everyone. And so what we create institutionally is then this siloed and this isolation that one experiences as a student going alone. Then it gets placed on that individual who happens also to be usually Latinx, or a person of who is Latino or Latina. And so institutions also have to think about creating supports in a multifaceted and multi-layered manner, right? And we can go down the line of what that means. That has an implication for how we structure our health student center, how we structure wellness, how we structure our own academics classes, right? And it becomes so important that it's not just a one-off that you do ethnic studies here, but that it becomes really kind of centered in the fabric of the university. Supports are not, our supports are not something that you access in an isolated manner. It's something that you access comprehensively.
Absolutely. I resonate, Pierre, with that experience of, for a lot of us in our campuses back in the day when we went to college, the undocumented student movement was underground and was sort of word of mouth. And then now there is more visibility and more enthusiasm and more visible undocu activism. But that structural integrative change into the entire fabric of the university is still a long way to go, right? And we have to think about the one person cannot solve an entire community's multidimensional, complicated nuances that they bring, which is what in Spanish we call being milusos, being a jack of all trades and having to multitask and do all the things that the university is asking for. So I appreciate your response. And
the thing is that we get really good at it, right? I mean,
yes.
we get really good at being jack of all
trades.
We learn. Because we've grown up in being jack of all trades.
Yes.
But then we have to recognize that as a system, as an institution, we can't take advantage of the people who are so freaking amazing at what they do because they grew up with that.
Yes.
So if we really want structural change, institutional change, the institution needs to, and again, I'm talking about Harvard only, I'm talking about in general, right? Needs to have a commitment to creating a whole infrastructure of support. Anyway,
Absolutely.
sorry. I get excited.
No, we can do this back and forth because I think you're right. We get good at it, and especially if we identified with being from that community, we have a sense of urgency, commitment to the student population, but then we burn out and we get pushed out and sort of people leave higher ed because of that. So I definitely appreciate that. So as someone who is one of sort of the highest ranked DACA recipients working at Harvard, what concerns do you have about the impact that DACA has on working professionals such as healthcare professionals and educators who are using their work permit to make a difference in institutions and in this country? And then more specifically, if you could tell us about how you've navigated your career, overcome any barriers in your higher ed journey, or even what you've done to make sure that you're thriving and not just surviving.
Sure. So the first question I can answer in so many ways, but one, I like kind of really concrete answers sometimes. So the first thing that comes to mind is when, many universities and many institutions have done really great work at saying we want to create environments of inclusion and belonging, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and done such an amazing job at marketing those efforts. But it's not just about getting people of color or marginalized communities to work or to apply, let alone work at those institutions. It's really about retaining. And it's also about making decisions from an intersectional lens. So what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example. We know a lot of institutions in higher education are going to be furloughing people or laying people off, right? We know that that's happening not just in higher education, but across the nation in different companies and different nonprofits. We know that, right? And that's a result of the pandemic. That's a result of what's happening. But if we really want to be intersectional and we really want to be having a lens of anti-oppression, if we really want to advance our efforts in diversity and inclusion and belonging, looking at those furloughs through the lens of intersectionality would mean that we are realizing that a lot of the people who would be on the furlough list or on the layoff list would be marginalized communities, right? And when it comes to undocumented people, what worries me most for our staff, for instance, and staff in other institutions, is that sometimes that person who has DACA or TPS is the only person in the family who is the breadwinner, who is the sustenance for that entire family. So it's not just that you're saying, here goes one person, is here goes an entire family. And they might, they're not making salaries that are astronomical by any means of the imagination. They're really doing, they're doing miracles with pennies. And so when you ask me, what are some of the things that worry me about the impermanence of DACA, that is one of the things from an institutional perspective, looking at our decisions from the lens of how will it impact people in the margins. To me, is a commitment to diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Your second question was around navigating career, and right?
Yep.
I have a mentor and a friend who always says, you make the best decision that you can for you with the information and resources that you have in that moment. And that takes, and I love that, because I feel like that's really how I've lived my life so much that I graduated from college, and then I thought, well, if I don't do something with it, if I don't go somewhere else, I'm going to be deported, or I'm not going to have a job. So grad school became the natural, entry point. And I looked for a grad school that would allow me to have a lot of freedom and flexibility in creating my program, which was Harvard Divinity School, as well as integrated field education and working while I was in school, right? So it was embedded in the program, because I would go nuts if all I did was this study. So I really needed to feel like I was part of the community. So I made that decision with a set of circumstances that I had at the time. And I think that it's difficult to live on a 2-year, a 2-year cycle that, DACA gets renewed every 2 years. But what I will say is that the stress that I experienced when I was younger, the stressors haven't really gone away, but the way that I've dealt with stress over the years has also shifted. And part of that is that you build resiliency over time, right? And you find community that you can rely on, as I mentioned, that allows you to get through it. Nobody should go through something like that in silence, right? Or by themselves. So that was really important for me. But you really do build strength. That's not to say that I still have days that before the DACA decision, I was breaking down, a few times a month. And those moments, were overwhelming moments of anxiety, and I'm really lucky to have a partner who is there for me and who is incredibly supportive, and we can talk through things and doesn't just try to fix something, but really tries to understand from a place of empathy. So it, when you're in a state of limbo and impermanence, you're going to have those moments of anxiety, of feeling desperation. That's going to happen. So what I've learned is to build my arsenal of resources to navigate those and to make decisions, the best decisions that I can at that moment with the resources that I have. And that sometimes might mean, I was thinking, well, if DACA goes away, maybe my career here is done and I have to move to Latin America. And that was, I had started thinking about making plans for doing that. So does it suck? Yes, but I'm also pretty much a pragmatist. And try to figure things out from that lens.
Absolutely.
It's not a great answer. I mean, it's just a real answer.
No, but it's where you are, and I appreciate that. I think many of us who are older, sometimes we do tell folks, we know what it's like to live without DACA. We know what it's like to live without a continuous impermanence. And I've heard in the queer community said it gets better, right? But it's still hard. Like the older you get, the more resilient, the more stronger you are about adapting, but it doesn't end, right? And so I definitely appreciate your vulnerability. And even going back to your point about at that point in grad school, you definitely wanted to keep going to higher ed. And that was the narrative that I was told too, go to school until immigration reform passes, right? Like for a lot of us who are in the older community, we just went on to get our masters and we figured it out. I mean, you and I went to the same schools and they gave us financial aid, but a lot of students don't have a master's degree like we did. That doesn't give them a fully funded program, or that doesn't give them that ability to really finish a degree. That's why we see a couple more folks go to a PhD directly, right? So I definitely wanted to give voice to that. Mm-hmm. And even to your point, and this connects to our last question on intersectionality, right? You identify as a gay, undocumented Latino, and you brought up the fact that our move and our higher educational institutional policy change has to be intersectional. And I think our immigrant rights movement has to be intersectional now as well. I mean, I remember when I saw Jose Antonio Vargas, who is a Filipino self-declared undocu-queer journalist, he posted on Twitter the day that the BGLTQ community had their landmark Supreme Court decision on Monday, when we had ours on Thursday, that intersectionality meant that gay and lesbian folks now have protections to not be fired, but that folks who had DACA could lose their work permit and be fired anyways, right? So that intersectional ability to look at the issue from multiple lenses. So I wondered if you could just end on a note of continues to remind us how we could be more inclusive in our approach in the fight for social justice within immigration.
You know, right now, my brain goes in so many directions as you ask that question. Right now, a lot of the social justice movement has concentrated really on, in this present moment, right, on abolishing the police, for instance, or police reform, right? We have to be really careful in not compartmentalizing a social justice, or fight for social justice, right? And what oftentimes happens is we see an issue and we say, here is a solution to that issue, but we're still doing the mainstream response to issue solution, issue solution, issue solution. And the thing is that with intersectionality, as we know, is that people live intersectional issues, right? Their intersectional identities lead to intersectional issues. I mean, that's a principle of intersectionality. And so it's not just the police, it's the disparities in the healthcare system. It's the fact that 33% of trans folks delay seeking preventative care because they have been turned away by a doctor, right, by their primary care physician. It's the fact that that when you look at the educational system, ethnic studies are just it's this elective that you take as opposed to not incorporated into the curriculum. It's the fact that we center the American independence in every history class, but we don't center Black and Latinx and Native histories into the curriculum, right? So we're looking at not just at the criminal justice system, we're looking at an entire fabric of society that is designed to maintain marginalized communities at the margins. And so we start thinking of social justice intersectionally. It means really looking at our solutions intersectionally, right? I mean, there is a reason that in child welfare, African-American children are represented in foster care almost 2 times the rate in the general population. And Native students Native children are almost 3 times the rate, right? So looking at this intersectionally really does mean looking at how so many systems intersect. I mean, when I worked at nationally in these issues, we had stories of doctors' offices calling eyes on people who were getting checked for an OBGYN exam. And so it's, racism and xenophobia come in different forms. I mean, what we saw with what happened with Breonna Taylor, with George Floyd, is so blatant. I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening outside. It's so blatant, and yet we still have, there is an entire fabric underneath it that allows for those things to happen, that we need to tackle. What I will say, I'll end on a note that, that oftentimes I get the question of like, how do your intersectional identities help you advocate for marginalized communities, right? And I say people who have lived in the margins have gotten so good at knowing and navigating systems, right? So reflecting on those marginalized identities really helps in knowing how I was going to say a bad word, how horrible the systems can be that are meant to support people. Anyway, I've taken enough time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Pierre, for getting us started, for getting those juices flowing. I'm just going to say, like, I'm friends with these folks, so we're going to have a conversation. We might go over time. I hope you will bear with us and still stay with us because these conversations are amazing. So now I want to invite Pamela Portocarrero to join me in a conversation as well. And so Pamela, you have studied public policy. You now work for the Kennedy School, which is a leading school of government. And you understand more than anyone in this group probably the impact that local, state, and federal public policies have on the lives of people. From your personal and professional lens of expertise, what did the Supreme Court decision on DACA mean to you, to your family, and potentially to the 700,000 other recipients impacted by this executive order? And if you could help us also keep this small win in mind with the nuances about our comprehensive immigration fight, especially in light of this election year.
Thanks, Diana. Well, not to belittle, of course, the decision by the Supreme Court, but it still puts us in a temporary state of documentation, quote unquote, with this work permit, right? We're still looking at having to renew our work permit every 2 years. We're still looking at having to save up the fees that are required to apply for renew our permit. We're still looking at having to fill out paperwork, having to go to an immigration office and get our fingerprints done, taking time off to do all these. So we're still looking at a whole myriad of steps and processes to have to do every so often. It is great because now we know that at least we get another 2 years, but it's also the way that the Supreme Court made the decision, it left it up to the administration to kind of decide on their next move, right? So kind of we're back to that where our fate is being left in the hands of a single individual. What we need and what goes into the second part of your question is immigration reform from Congress, right? Legislation that would make it more permanent, that would make it across the board and not have these various policies across states or across cities, which can also hinder the progress of individuals in this situation. So again, I think many people felt relieved and many people were excited. I myself was very glad, of course, to hear the decision that I get to continue working and to continue living in this place that I call home and continue being with my family and being with the people I love. But at the same time, it's like, okay, another 2 years, we need something that's more permanent.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I resonate with that even in just the statement that USCIS posted right after the decision saying, you know, they didn't agree with the Supreme Court, right? And that harms our community because that is the institution, that's the agency that our people are looking towards for renewing and applying for the first time. So we got a little fresh of air and then we have to keep working because we are reminded that like even that is taken away. So thank you for that. And then Pamela, you also, as you've seen, higher ed institutions are getting more involved in public policy advocacy efforts as well on behalf of their students. We saw this with President Faust, who publicly advocated for the DREAM Act in 2009, for the DACA program in 2016, and also now with President Bacal, who advocated for TPS and DACA recipients in 2019. In your experience or in your expertise, what do you envision to be the role that higher ed institutions have as it pertains to lobbying for public policy efforts in support of their students? What power do they have as institutions? And what should senior leaders keep in mind when they say we are committed to advocating for undocumented and DACA-mentor students?
Oh, I believe wholeheartedly that institutions of higher education have a lot of power when it comes to advocating for their students, and this includes their documented and undocumented students. I am from the state of Utah. I did a lot of my work in that state. I worked in higher education in that state. And what allowed me to seek and access my college degree was a House bill called HB 144, which allowed for in-state tuition, kind of similar to what California had and what Matias was able to benefit from. But this is not a widespread federal policy. Each state has decided to kind of take this upon themselves and allow for their student population who happens to be undocumented to be able to pay in-state tuition, given the fact that they've grown up in that state. So this came about, of course, from the efforts of the communities that support these types of policies, but also from institutions of higher education and the leadership in those institutions. Another recent instance that happened over in the state of Utah, the certain public institutions were able to work and provide scholarships to undocumented students and documented students, something that was not available to them before. Already undocumented and documented students are not able to apply for financial aid, for federal financial aid. So the fact that these institutions took up that issue and saw it upon themselves to advocate for these students and make it possible for scholarship funds to be awarded to them is, again, another example. I know that also some states, with the pressure from institutions of higher education, have allowed for their students who are undocumented and are DACA recipients to apply for state financial aid, which is another big step. But again, so we have all these different examples and various policies, like I mentioned before, across states. But behind that, of course, is the hard work of communities who are directly impacted by these policies, but also these institutions of higher education who get to interact with these students on a daily basis and see their hard work and their struggle to be able to obtain a college degree. And I think that here, the panelists, we've been able to go through that struggle ourselves and see it firsthand. But also, I think we've had those individuals in our different institutions of education that have advocated for us and have allowed us to be successful in those spaces, even if they weren't necessarily built to allow us to obtain those degrees in that education. So starting from the top, leadership, mentors, faculty, administrators, everybody needs to be on board with the simple fact that the students need access to higher education, all students, regardless of their immigration status, and making those steps in order to build those structures and those systems, whether it's within their own institution or at the state and federal level, it is extremely important, and I think it is part of their responsibility.
Absolutely. And thank you for reminding us, Pamela, of the landscape that the undocumented student experience really varies state by state. And this is something that Professor Roberto Gonzalez talks about, right? That in the face of Congress failing to pass immigration reform, that it's been the local community and the state communities that have taken it upon themselves to pass these in-state tuition bills, bills that Massachusetts hasn't been able to pass for the last 10 years, right? So we in Massachusetts still do not have an in-state tuition bill for undocumented students or a state financial aid bill that we have in California, where I'm from, right? So reminding us that higher ed institutions within this sort of their power is to help not only the local community and state community, but also at the national level. Absolutely. So then my last question to you, Pamela, is as a recent mother, and congratulations to you, and as someone who is also from a mixed status family where you saw your mom and your sister be able to get their citizenship while you weren't able to get yours, what does family unity and reunification mean to you, and the impact that immigration policies have on the family? And what legacy do you hope to leave for your descendants and future immigrant children?
So taking a step back a little bit from DACA and DACA recipients, overall we need an overhaul of immigration reform. Although certain individuals right now are able to benefit from DACA within those specific requirements, there are so many more, thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions of individuals who have absolutely zero, they don't have a path to adjusting their status. And that is unacceptable, especially when these individuals have been living here for years, for decades, when they have family members who are US citizens, who are working and contributing to this economy, to this country, to the communities that they live in, who are taking care of our fellow elderly population, our children, just they are already a part of the fabric of this country, and the fact that they are invisible, that they are hiding, that we do not recognize them in any way, it's, like I said, it's unacceptable, and something needs to be done about that in the form of immigration reform, and allowing for them to, through some mechanism, through some application, through some evaluation, be able to adjust their status and be recognized and stop living in fear. Like you mentioned, I do come from a mixed status families, and I'm one of the several examples of how the immigration process in the immigration system is broken, where my mom and my sister, who is younger than me, were able to adjust their status, but I wasn't, through, several different reasons why. But that's because this immigration process is so complicated. Many people need to have an attorney to even start the process, and dish out hundreds and thousands of dollars. So this is not working. It's not working, and it's not serving the people that it's supposed to be serving. For that same reason, we are seeing that a lot of families are being separated, and children are being torn away from their parents. Parents are having to make the hard decision of going back to their countries of birth, or leaving their kids behind in this country because they're US citizens. No family, no parent should have to be put in that position, and to make those decisions where they have to think about separating their families. Mm-hmm. And I just want to end on a note that now, being a parent myself, and my daughter having been born here, and me being a DACA recipient, being in this state of limbo, I wonder how long we're going to keep this up. How long am I going to be renewing my work authorization every 2 years? And will my daughter be 18 years old and look at me and see what this country has done for me, while at the same time not letting me be recognized fully as an American? And what will she think about her country, the people in power? And I wonder about that. So yeah, hopefully she can have a different future, and she can look at her mom and see that she is a rightful member, just as she is, of this beautiful nation. And hopefully by then there'll be something more permanent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pamela. And thank you for reminding us that even when one of us in our family gets status, we still worry about the rest of us, which is why, the movement shifted from not only caring about the DREAM Act, but also ultimately comprehensive immigration reform. Like, we can't just have the students and the children get access to things. That was what DAPA was going to do, is give the parents some relief that we now have for those who have DACA. So thank you for that, and I appreciate your voice. I'm excited for all of you to be able to engage with these amazing folks in our Q&A section. Now I'm going to invite Matias to our Zoom conversation. And Matias, my first question for you is, as a formerly undocumented young student, you became super, super involved with the campaign for the Federal DREAM Act. In 2010, your commitment to this cause led you to get detained and to begin your deportation proceedings in Minnesota. Tell us a little bit more about your experience as an activist, what you've learned over the years about political power, about advocacy and social change, and what's something you wish the younger folks knew about the immigrant rights movement, and even the role that the media plays in telling our narratives.
Thank you, Diana. Again, I'm Matias. I work at the Phillips Brooks Association here at Harvard. And one of the things we hold on to here is promoting students, making public service and community organizing a key part of their undergraduate experience. And I really love being part of that mission, because for me, being an undergraduate also meant being part of a strong support group of undocumented students who were interested in sharing resources, scholarship opportunities, ideas for getting by, and monitoring what was the situation in Washington, D.C., and whether we would be able to get a solution out of the government. It was being part of that community that then motivated me to make that leap of faith and move to the East Coast. I think that it's so important. I got in trouble, in a sense, with deportation proceedings, but it also gave me the ability to call into question how it was that once I was in deportation proceedings, then I had the ability to get a work permit. And why couldn't that be done proactively for the thousands that eventually got DACA? I think that for me, it was a great formative experience, and I hope that the DACA youth, or even those who are graduating now and don't have the opportunity to get DACA but are undocumented, know that it took a lot of initiative and courage that was rooted in young people coming together to support one another. That's already written in so many great ways. But I think that is a key part of it for me, that I got to be part in a community. And that's what I would really say institutions of higher education do have a role to play in fostering students creating those self-supported community spaces, because the situation is tough, is overbearing sometimes to be undocumented, and the best interlocutors are always going to be people that are facing that same situation, and universities can moderate those spaces so that people find each other to support one another. Mm-hmm. And also the policy and legal advocacy that universities are able to do is so important. When we see this DACA case, it's a combination of many of the lawsuits that came after the Trump administration's decision. But at the top of that summary of lawsuits, it was the University of California versus the administration. And to me, that's very meaningful. That's very meaningful because the institution itself does have a level of stability and meaning that individuals cannot achieve on their own.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Matias. And thank you for bringing that expertise. And that leads into my second question perfectly, right? If you're talking about Undocu-student activism and how you felt empowered by the community that you joined when you were in college, right? And you are an alum of UCLA Ideas, who's one of the leading student orgs, at least in my eyes, that I consider leading student immigrant org in higher ed, as well as the United We Dream Network, the largest Undocu youth immigrant movement organization. So speaking about student activism, what do you wish higher ed administrators understood about undocumented students who are actively engaged in their campus community and actively pushing for the institution to do more and to be held accountable? How can they better understand student activism if you're speaking to higher ed administrators and senior leaders?
I think this is part of what we're constantly helping students reflect on and plan for here at PBHA. We want students to exercise their free speech in an intelligent way, and in a way that's not just rooted in your opinions, but that you actually take the time to listen to the community you're aiming to represent and building a base of support for your cause. And that's not just for undocumented or immigrant students, but for any students who are part of our program and our work that also see political advocacy as part of what they intend to do collectively. I think that we have a strong base of student advocacy here at Harvard and in Massachusetts generally. I think the people are waiting for an opportunity. I want to also pay attention to Sheila's question, who's bringing up what are the aspects of immigration reform that do have good prospects. And that's kind of a heartbreaking question at this point, because I sense there is a lot of initiative and a lot of desire for young people to be, to speak out and to be active. Yet at the same time, the politics generally seems, even before the pandemic, seems so broken and so unwilling to compromise that also turns off a lot of people from even. I think we have to wait. This is a time now for reform to be on the back of our minds, because there is a lot of sense of urgency to dealing to this pandemic environment. However, there is a lot of opportunities still for young people to come together and either build spaces in the institutions they belong to, maybe work at the local or state level to create incremental changes that they may not give you that legal status transition that you seek, but might actually create opportunities and resources for undocumented communities.
Absolutely. There is so much power in joining a local community, a movement, because a lot of the resources are found in those local hubs, right? And those oftentimes we need to be able to get plugged into those spaces. My last question for you, Matias, is you have now transitioned into a formally undocumented status. You're now a permanent resident like me. While we want everyone to be able to adjust like us, what has been your experience transitioning to this part of sort of your legal status? How are you balancing guilt, gratitude, having to unlearn or heal from the experience? And then what is your commitment still to the community, even though now you're formally undocumented?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are parts of that process of growing up and seeing things in a new perspective that have to do with me getting my green card, and other parts of it that also have to do with, you know, being more removed from the average undergraduate age. I think when it comes to my legal status, obviously that has opened up a huge number of opportunities, and it is also gives you that sense of calmness about it's permanent, right? And that kind of gives you an opportunity to dream bigger in a sense. I think that one thing that was also very influential for me, that also made me a little bit more of a risk taker, was that I had the privilege of feeling like if something happened to me and I couldn't stay here, I would be okay. For two reasons. One is because I came from Argentina a little older, and coming here at age 13 is a lot different than coming to the US at age 5, for example. And I sensed that difference from my peers early on at times. I had a sister who had moved back. So when she was 21, she's 3 years older than I. And the fact that she had chosen to go back on her own and had started her own work career there kind of gave me a little bit more safety in a sense. I would say that it's important to honor and recognize that your status is giving you a lot of trouble, or it might prevent you from fully exploring all the things you want to explore. However, it's also important to check yourself and know which parts of it do have to do with my lack of status, or am I making it the problem to all my problems. And I think that's important. It's tough to hear sometimes. It was certainly tough to hear for me when my big problem was that I didn't have legal status. But I think it's important to remind young people of that. And I think there are parts of it that your question hinted at that have to do with kind of that survivor's guilt, or maybe that imposter syndrome, that feeling that comes when you feel like you've broken a barrier to get to a place, but you're not really having yet come into terms with where you come from and how it all lines up together. That takes a lot of processing. I encourage people to seek support, whether it's in the form of therapy or peer networks, because it's helpful. It's helpful to take that question on for yourself. It's also not really only limited to whether you're undocumented or not. I think there are coming of age questions, and going from who you were as a teenager to who you are when you are a young adult leaving college, that everybody has to face. And for us here, it's putting them to work also in the community. Everybody has to deal with those questions when you're a college student. Go find an answer that's also aligned to the perspective you gain when you're involved in community-based work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you remind us that for a lot of us when we were younger, a bill or being able to adjust our status was like the end goal, right? And that once we have that, everything's going to be perfect and better. At least definitely has been better for me. But reminding ourselves that once we do adjust our status, there's still a lot of healing that we have to go through, because I still fear the cops when they're around me, and they don't fear me, right? Because I'm a light-skinned Latina, but I know that there's still internalized oppression and trauma that so many of us have gone through, that it will take years for our mind to catch up with our heart. And so there's still a lot of exploration in that area for formally undocumented folks to have the space to unpack together. So as promised, we gave you an amazing panel discussion. We are going to stop recording so that we can now open it up for a Q&A.